Hello, Management 6084 students. I'm Professor Mary Zellmer-Bruhn. So far, I think you've seen me in other recorded content, but this is going to be the first of several short videos that go into a little bit more detail about specific topics that I presented in those sort of general background lessons that I've posted already on Canvas. And this one in particular is just going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to think about different kinds of teams. So in that introductory video, I talked a bit about the difference between groups and teams, and some of the reason we care about that is that true teams that follow this definition, are much more difficult to form and much more difficult to get the best performance out of. And that comes from a variety of things, but one of the biggest is that true teams have outcome interdependence and task interdependence. So people have to work together, they have to interact, they have to collaborate, share information and knowledge and resources to get their work done. Whereas work groups, oftentimes people can really work independently and their work is just sort of summarized to create the performance of the group, the department, the store, or the organization. And so just as a reminder, we're going to work with this definition of teams as a collection of individuals, right? So, it is a set of people. So there's where we're similar to groups. But one of the most vital parts of what makes a team is this idea of interdependence. I can't do my work without you. You have to provide something for me. And so I rely on my teammates. And that source of interdependence is what creates a lot of the challenge, right? So it can produce things like conflict, which we'll talk more about next week. Because if you're not producing what I need or you're not delivering it on time, that may cause my performance to suffer as an individual, but it also may lower the overall performance of the team, for example. Again, responsibility for outcomes. This is the idea of outcome interdependence. We'll talk more about this when we get into the idea of alignment as a structural feature as part of this first week of class. The idea of how our team's rewarded, what happens when we want teamwork but focus on individual rewards. Those kinds of questions come to play and is why this point matters, to think about outcome interdependence or responsible collectively for some kind of productive outcome. The other thing is we see people as an intact social entity. And again here, this one is an important, I think, boundary condition to what we're talking about. Most of the time, most teams and organizations are fairly stable. They have members, they have work that continues on. But as you already saw in the readings, we'll talk just a little bit about in a moment here, there are short-term teams. And in that lesson about how teams kind of develop over time, I talked a little bit about this idea of these sort of ad hoc or crisis teams. The book also talked about crisis teams. And you can be sure that there are plenty of these kinds of teams sprung into action now with this incredible, historically unprecedented COVID-19 experience we're all having. The point is, there can be teams that are very temporary, and we'll be talking about that a bit in our case discussion. We'll be talking about it on our last day, on our third week of class. The idea that there are dynamic teams, there's teaming as a verb, where organizations have people kind of self-organize and create teams that work on something for a short period of time, and then people move off or move away from that. So I just wanted to point that out, that is a little bit of a boundary condition. Not all teams have to be stable over time. If you look at this definition, it was created in 1997. And so the idea of how teams operate and how there can be temporary teams and crisis teams forming for a short period of time and then disbanding quickly or reorganizing quickly is definitely an evolution of where teams have come from when these initial definitions were created. A couple other things that matter here are that they are in larger social systems. They exist in an organization. And in our discussion of the CNS case, we'll talk about that because it matters what kind of culture you have. It matters what kind of organizational structure and reward systems and HR systems you have. you can't get teams to work the way you want them to work if you don't have those system things in place. And so we'll talk a little bit about that idea of context when we kick things off with CNS, but we'll also talk more about that in our third week as well, thinking about how this last thing matters, which is that teams also have to connect across the boundary. They don't exist in isolation. They have to go lobby their managers. They have to go sell their ideas. They might have to go beg for resources, including possibly more team members. So all of those things matter in terms of thinking about what it takes to make a team effective. And they will matter at different points in time, and depending upon which team and how things are going, one of these might be something you have to focus on more than another thing. And we'll be discussing that idea of how do you diagnose, how do you figure out what the thing is that you have to deal with right now in your team as we go across this class. So already discussed in my introductory video and in your readings are the idea that there are different kinds of teams or different reasons teams get formed. And so one of those things is to think a little bit about team purpose. And a part of this is to ask yourself, why do you want a team? Is a team really the best approach to a problem? You know, there's other kinds of mechanisms. There's other sorts of ways to get interaction to happen. And sometimes teams are costly and ineffective. Thompson in the book says, you know, it kind of should be the last resort. I don't know if I fully agree with that, but the point is you should know what you're trying to accomplish. And there are tasks that are not really well suited for teams, and they don't make sense for teams. So part of what we'll be uncovering in our discussion of the CNS case is that question. Is this kind of work in a warehouse that they're trying to make teams do, is that really work that makes sense to have teams working on? And we'll think about why you might or might not think so. So one of the first things is to think about what the purpose of the team is. Teams also vary, as you saw in the introductory video, on this kind of authority structure, which varies in terms of, you know, how much control does the team have over both developing and creating itself, or, you know, from the one end of the spectrum to the other end where they're formed by a leader and told what to do. So we'll get into more of that, I think, also in the case. But there's other ways that we think about team types. And one article that came, you know, a couple different people, I told you about Cohen and Bailey already with the definition, is that, you know, people have tried to say, well, how do teams vary, and like what matters then in terms of how they're run, for example. So, you know, maybe there's management teams are a certain kind of team where we have the senior leadership of an organization or boards of directors. They have a different mission and purpose, and they might be run differently than a frontline production team, for example, which might be much more manager-led, which might be sort of given its goals and given its responsibilities versus sort of forming those and creating them themselves. But a challenge here is that there are so many different ways we can slice this, and you could actually have, you know, a team that is an action team that's also a production team, for example. So one challenge that researchers have come upon is to say we could come up with dozens and dozens of different ways to label teams, and at some point that becomes useless to try to come up with every single kind of team. So one attempt to remedy this was created by John Hollenbeck at Michigan State University just a few years ago with a couple of his co-authors. They published a paper in the Academy of Management Review, and they said, you know, probably a more productive way to think about it is that there's dimensions along which teams vary. And if we have these dimensions, we can plot teams on the dimensions. And that can help us understand you know, what might be the particular challenges of a team. So let me just put a couple things out here to show you. They suggested that, you know, one dimension we've already heard about is authority. So that was in my initial lecture and in the textbook about who is really in charge and what is the team in charge of versus what is a specific external or internal leader in charge of. So high authority differentiation are teams that have strong leaders who dictate an awful lot of what the team is responsible for. And at the low end of this are autonomous or self-managing teams. So teams that really have control over what they're deciding to work on and how they're trying to decide to do that. And I would say even at a more extreme end of this would be what Thompson described and I talked about in that initial lecture as self-governing teams, right? Teams that actually create themselves. A startup team would be in that bucket. They would have very low authority differentiation. The second dimension that they identify is temporal stability. And this goes back to that initial definition that I mentioned, that some teams are very stable. They're put together and they stay together over time. So, these teams might be what some people call real teams or ongoing intact teams. There might be a product leadership team or a brand management team in your organization that's a standing team that's kind of a permanent structural part of the organization. Lasts for a long time until maybe the organization rethinks the product or rethinks the need for that particular team, and then it may change over time. At the other end, one-shot lab teams, I think there's a lot of those going on now where there's a specific problem to resolve, problem is solved, team dissolves, okay? Maybe advice groups brought together. I have a couple of those going on right now in this crisis time, where we have people meeting right now on a regular basis to address evolving challenges with the COVID-19 crisis. So those groups will not stay together permanently once the phase of this change. We may need different advice teams or different temporary teams created as things evolve over the coming weeks and months. And then the last one is skill differentiation. And we'll get into this when we talk more about composition. It was already brought up again in my introductory lecture about the idea that we have teams that maybe range from being homogeneous or similar. Some production teams might have people who have all the same kinds of skills, to teams that have high levels of diversity and a need for higher levels of diversity. And this comes into play when we think about roles and responsibilities and the challenges of making decisions about specialization versus generalization, for example. And we can also think about teams, that we have challenges when we have multiple functions. We'll discuss the challenges there in terms of how hard it can be for people to understand and utilize different expertise. Much of that's going to come up in week 2. So again, this is a way just to think through how do you understand how teams vary, and as you look at where they sit here, you can then begin to unpack what might be the most significant challenges, right? So a one-shot lab team, a crisis team coming together, the challenges to that kind of team are going to be, how do people establish trust really quickly because they don't have time? How do they understand what their roles are? How do they know what they should be working on and what others should be working on? So that sort of structure of how to come together and work quickly is really vital there. That might not be the same thing as a team that's ongoing and may occasionally have one new member come in. And then there's a different kind of challenge with how to socialize that person and onboard and include that person. So that's a little bit of a way to think about why do we care about different kinds of teams. Okay, so one last slide here on introduction to what are teams and different kinds of teams. This is an image from the textbook, and you can go there and spend some more time reading it. I don't want to spend a lot of time in the video here, but another way, I think kind of to think about how teams vary is by the task they do itself. And Thompson discusses this idea of 3 different general types of tasks. Tactical tasks, which are well-defined and well understood and get repeated over and over and over. So some examples of this would be an airline crew, the cockpit crew. So they have a well-defined set of activities that, barring some crisis or disruption, they execute the same over and over and over. And so some of the things that vary in terms of tactical teams is it's really important to have clear roles so people know exactly what they're supposed to do and when, and execute that very clearly, because you don't want people trying to do the other's work when there's a clearly defined set of activities. There's lots of tactical teams, but they also do have to train for the potential for something happening. So I've worked studying nuclear plant control crews, and 99.999% of the time what they do is routine, right? They're running the control of the power plant and they're executing a set of tasks that are the same over and over and over. But if something goes wrong, they need to understand how to break out of that routine. So a team like that needs to train for these unusual events. And it's why flight crews and nuclear control crews train in simulators, because they usually don't face a problem. So that kind of team needs to understand very well how to execute the routine, but then we have to, as organizations and leaders, figure out how to present them with problems in case something happens so they're ready to act on the fly for that. Problem-solving teams, this could be something like, how do we take an entire university and put it online in about a week, right? So we have a lot of teams here working on those. We have groups of instructional design experts working together around the clock, developing materials. And so they have to figure out, what matters to people, how to time things, what's essential to start with, what's something that can be phased in later. Those are problem-solving teams. They usually work on non-routine tasks, as do creative teams. So in some ways, there's a little bit of overlap between those two. Sometimes problem-solving teams are obviously working on creative outcomes as well. So, again, why does it matter? It matters because the needs of the team, including who should be on the team, what kind of people should be on that team, will vary across these types of teams and the other ways we can think about different kinds of teams. What the leader has to do, what the role of a leader is going to be different across the kinds of teams. So if you're thinking about understanding what you should do to make your team more effective, a starting point is to think through its purpose and what kind of work the team is doing. And then we'll get into things like the structure of the team, how to set goals, and what kind of goals would be more appropriate for different kinds of teams. How does the type of team alter the effectiveness of certain kinds of structural interventions? These are why we matter, why we care about the different kinds of teams. And so I suggest just thinking about the teams you work on now and spending a little time trying to categorize them. Use these tools, use these dimensions, use the kind of tasks, think through the authority structure, and that will help you think a little bit about diagnosing what sort of team you have, and then you'll be able to use that as we go forward to think about what are the right kind of interventions to support the effectiveness of that particular team.